At 33, I took a job as the caretaker for a secluded graveyard in the hills of northern Pennsylvania. I needed a break from the chaos of the city, and this quiet place seemed perfect. The graveyard was small and rarely used, accompanied by an old, dilapidated cabin built back in the late 1800s. When I arrived in October of 2022, the weather was crisp, and the autumn leaves were just beginning to change. The scene was serene in a melancholic way. Tall trees surrounded the cemetery, casting shadows over the moss-covered gravestones. The cabin, situated at the forest's edge, was a bit further back. The first thing I noticed when entering the cabin was the smell, a musty, damp odor that hit me as soon as I opened the door. The floorboards groaned beneath my boots, and the walls were covered with peeling wallpaper. The place wasn't luxurious, but it had a working stove, a bed, and a small table. It would serve its purpose. My responsibilities were simple: maintain the graveyard by trimming weeds, clearing debris, and keeping the paths tidy. It was peaceful work, and I appreciated the solitude. At first, the days passed without incident. The sound of birds filled the air, and the occasional rustle in the bushes was the only break in the silence. However, after a few weeks, I began to notice odd things. The cemetery, for instance, had a few headstones dating back to the mid-1800s, but there were others that seemed much newer, with the most recent being from 2000. It wasn't that this was strange in itself, but there was a sense of neglect. No flowers on the graves, no signs of visitors for years. The cabin at night also felt different. The woods around it were eerily quiet. No crickets, no owls, just an unnatural stillness. Strange noises started to seep in too. Faint scratching sounds against the walls, and sometimes what seemed like the soft creak of footsteps on the porch. I convinced myself it was just animals. Then one night I woke to a rhythmic tapping. It sounded like someone was knocking on the cabin's walls. I grabbed a flashlight and stepped outside, but there was nothing there. Just the dark yard and the fog-shrouded graveyard in the distance. The next morning, I noticed fresh footprints outside the cabin. They were too large to be mine, leading from the edge of the woods to the cabin and stopping abruptly. No prints leading back into the trees. After that, I started carrying a hunting knife with me. I wasn't sure if it was a prankster, a drifter, or something else, but I didn't want to take any chances. A week later, I was clearing fallen branches when I noticed something off about one of the graves. The dirt around it looked disturbed, uneven, as if someone had hastily dug it up and filled it back in. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was just erosion from the rain. But that night, things escalated. I heard heavy breathing outside the cabin. When I looked out the window, a shadow moved between the trees. I locked the door and stayed up all night, gripping my knife. The next morning, I checked the grave again, and it was worse. The dirt had been scattered more, and the headstone was knocked over. Someone had clearly been digging. I called the property owner, a man named Greg, who lived a couple of hours away. He claimed he hadn't been to the graveyard in years, but seemed unconcerned. Probably just an animal, he said. I didn't believe him, but I didn't have any proof to argue. Later that evening, I set up a motion-activated camera near the grave. The next morning, when I checked the footage, my stomach sank. Most of the night was just static, but around 3 a.m., the screen cleared briefly, and I saw a tall figure standing in the graveyard. It was hard to make out any details, but the figure was motionless. The camera went back to static after a few seconds. I decided to stay one more night. My nerves were on edge, but I was ready to leave. That night was the worst of all. I locked the doors and windows and kept a lantern burning. Around midnight, the tapping started again, louder this time, followed by heavy breathing, much closer than before. My heart raced as I clutched the knife. Suddenly, there was a loud bang on the door, and the wood shook under the force. I shouted out, but there was no answer. Another bang, then another. I didn't wait to find out what was on the other side. I grabbed my backpack, bolted out the back door, and ran into the woods. I kept running, stumbling over roots and branches, until I saw the headlights of my truck in the distance. I jumped in, locked the doors, and sped down the winding road as fast as I could. A week later, I came across a news article about the graveyard. The police had been called after a hiker found a body there, not buried, but propped against a tree, wrapped in a tarp. The body was fresh, and the police suspected foul play, but the article didn't elaborate. The graveyard and cabin were abandoned once more, left to rot and decay. I'll never know who or what I encountered there. All I know is that I was lucky to escape. I was 23 when my grandmother passed away. She had always been a reserved woman, living alone in a small cabin deep in the woods of northern Maine. I hadn't spent much time there growing up, as my parents preferred the city, and the isolation of the cabin wasn't appealing to them. Still, I had visited a few times, enough to remember the dense forest and the eerie quiet that surrounded the place. After she passed, the cabin became mine. At first, I thought about selling it. What use did I have for an old wooden house miles away from anywhere? But then my curiosity got the better of me. I wanted to see it again, sort through her belongings, and perhaps discover something about her life I never knew. I drove up in early December. In hindsight, it wasn't the best choice. Snow was already falling in patches, and the roads were rough. By the time I reached the cabin, the sun was low, casting long shadows through the trees. The cabin looked just as I remembered, small and weathered, with a sagging porch and a rusty metal roof. The air was cold, and the woods were silent except for the occasional rustling of leaves. I parked my car and grabbed my bag before stepping onto the creaking porch. The key was exactly where my father had told me it would be, hidden under a loose board next to the door. Inside, the cabin smelled of dust and old wood. The furniture was sparse: an old couch, a small kitchen table, and a wood-burning stove in the corner. I could see my breath as I exhaled. The place hadn't been heated in years. I set to work lighting the stove and unpacking a few things I had brought with me. As the fire warmed the cabin, I began exploring. Most of the furniture was covered with sheets, and the cabinets were filled with old canned goods, their labels faded and peeling. I found a stack of newspapers from the late 1980s and a small collection of books, mostly mysteries and thrillers. In one of the bedrooms, I found a chest full of quilts and blankets. Beneath them was a bundle of old letters tied with string. I didn't read them right away, deciding to go through them later. That first night, I slept in a sleeping bag on the floor in front of the stove. The woods outside were pitch black, and the wind howled through the trees, making the cabin creak and groan. I tried to convince myself it was just the wind, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The next day, I decided to take a walk around the property. My grandmother's land stretched over several acres, mostly dense with trees. I followed a narrow trail that led to a frozen creek, the ground crunching under my boots as I walked. I noticed small signs of wildlife, tracks in the snow, the occasional rustle of branches, but no animals in sight. The woods felt unusually quiet, like they were holding their breath. Near the creek, I found an old shed I didn't remember from my childhood. It was leaning to one side, its roof partially caved in. Curious, I stepped inside. The floor was covered in dirt and leaves, and the air smelled damp. In the corner, I found a stack of old hunting traps, rusted and useless. Next to them was a large wooden crate. I pried it open and found a collection of tools, an axe, a saw, and a hammer, well used but still in decent condition. At the time, I didn't think much of it, but as I walked back to the cabin, I felt like I was being watched. I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone or something behind me, but the woods remained empty. That night, the wind picked up again, rattling the windows and making the stovepipe howl. I stayed up late, going through the letters I'd found. Most were from my father and his siblings, written when they were young, thanking my grandmother for birthday gifts or updating her on their lives. But one letter stood out. It was from someone named Richard, dated 1975. The handwriting was messy, and the paper was yellowed and brittle. "Anna," it read, "I don't know how much longer I can stay here. The woods are changing. I hear things at night, things that shouldn't be out there. I tried to tell the others, but they think I'm crazy. Please, if you ever come back, be careful. Don't stay too long." I read the letter several times, trying to make sense of it. Who was Richard? What did he mean about the woods changing? I had no answers, and the unease in my chest only grew. The next few days were a blur of small tasks. Cleaning, chopping firewood, organizing the cabin. But every time I stepped outside, I felt that same sensation of being watched. It started as a faint prickling at the back of my neck, but by the fourth day, it was nearly unbearable. That night, I woke to a strange noise outside. It was a low, rhythmic thumping, like someone was pounding on a tree. I lay frozen, listening as the sound moved closer to the cabin. When it stopped, the silence was deafening. I didn't dare move, didn't even breathe, until the first light of dawn filtered through the windows. I spent the morning searching the woods around the cabin, looking for any sign of what had made the noise. Near the creek, I found a tree with deep gouges in the bark, as if something had clawed at it. The snow around it was disturbed, but there were no clear tracks, just an odd circular pattern in the ground. That evening, I decided to leave. The cabin had become too unsettling, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I packed my things and loaded them into the car, but when I tried to start it, the engine wouldn't turn over. I popped the hood and immediately saw the problem. The battery cables had been cut. Panic set in. I grabbed my phone, but there was no signal. I was miles from the nearest town, and the sun was already setting. I spent that night barricaded in the cabin. Every light turned on, the axe from the shed by my side. The wind howled outside, and I thought I heard footsteps on the porch, but when I checked, no one was there. The next morning, I started walking, hoping to find help or at least get a better signal for my phone. The woods seemed darker than before, the trees pressing in on either side. After about an hour, I saw something ahead, a figure standing in the road. It was a man dressed in old, tattered clothes, his face hidden beneath a hood. I called out, but he didn't respond. As I got closer, I realized he wasn't moving at all. He was just standing there, staring at me. I turned and ran, my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't stop until I reached the cabin and slammed the door shut behind me. I don't know how long I sat there, clutching the axe, waiting for something to happen, but nothing did. Eventually, I managed to flag down a snowplow that passed by on the road and hitched a ride back to town. I never returned to the cabin. A few months later, I sold the property. The buyer didn't ask many questions, and I didn't offer any explanations. But sometimes, late at night, I think about that man in the woods. I wonder who or what he was and what might have happened if I had stayed just a little longer. It was the summer of 2020 when my cousin Jake, who had recently retired from the military, suggested we take a week-long trip to a remote cabin in Wyoming. Jake was a tough, no-nonsense kind of guy, but there was a quiet warmth to him that I admired. He rarely spoke about his time in the service, but I always wondered about the things he had seen and done. This trip wasn't about digging into his past. It was about getting away from everything and finding some peace in the wild. The cabin was far from civilization, tucked away deep in the woods. Jake had rented it from an old friend who assured him it was secure, stocked with the essentials, and had a generator for power. That sounded good to me. I was eager to escape the noise of daily life, to enjoy the clear skies, and disconnect from everything. The drive took nearly 6 hours, the last part of the journey on a narrow dirt road winding through the forest. The trees lined the road so closely they nearly formed a tunnel. We arrived just before sunset. The cabin was small but sturdy, with thick wooden walls and a stone chimney. A wide porch wrapped around the front, offering a view of a small clearing and the trees beyond. We unloaded our supplies, mostly canned goods, water bottles, and Jake's gear, including a large hunting knife and a rifle. Jake was always ready for anything, and his military experience showed in everything he did. I wasn't sure we'd need weapons, but Jake insisted it was better to be safe than sorry. The cabin was simple as expected. Inside, there was one big room with a small kitchen area, a table with 2 chairs, and a couch next to a wood stove. A door in the back led to a tiny bedroom with 2 bunk beds. It wasn't fancy, but it was clean and practical. We spent the evening getting settled, with Jake showing me how to use the generator, checking the locks on all the windows and doors, and setting up a small campfire outside. As night fell, the forest around us came alive with the sounds of chirping crickets, distant owl calls, and the rustle of leaves in the wind. By the time we went to bed, the cabin felt safe, though I couldn't shake a slight sense of unease. Maybe it was the isolation, or maybe just my imagination. Jake, however, seemed perfectly at ease. Around 2 a.m., I woke up to a faint noise outside, a soft crunching, like footsteps on dry leaves. I lay still, listening. The sound came again, closer this time. I glanced over at Jake, who was awake too, his hand resting on the rifle next to him. Neither of us spoke. The footsteps stopped, followed by a long silence. After a while, Jake whispered that it was probably just an animal. I wanted to believe him, so I closed my eyes and tried to sleep. The next morning, Jake was up early checking around the cabin. I joined him outside, and we found some faint footprints in the dirt near the porch. They weren't from any animal. They were human. Jake wasn't too concerned. He said it could have been a hiker or someone from the area, but he still walked the perimeter, inspecting the area for anything unusual. We found nothing, so we went on with our day. That morning, we hiked through the woods, exploring the land around the cabin. Jake taught me how to navigate using landmarks and a compass, skills he said were essential in these remote areas. By the time we returned, I felt more comfortable being out there. That night, the footsteps returned. This time they were louder, and they didn't stop at the edge of the clearing. They came right up to the cabin. Both Jake and I were awake, sitting in the dark, the rifle ready. The footsteps circled the cabin slowly, then stopped. The silence that followed was more unnerving than the sound itself. We waited for what felt like hours before Jake whispered that we should stay inside and stay quiet. The next morning, we found more footprints, this time leading away from the cabin and deeper into the woods. Jake decided we should follow them just to see where they led. We walked for about an hour, the trail taking us further into the forest. Eventually, we came across an old, abandoned campsite. There was a collapsed tent, a rusty fire pit, and some torn fabric hanging from a tree. It looked like no one had been there for years, but the footprints stopped there. Jake didn't say much as we turned back toward the cabin, but I could tell he was feeling uneasy, even if he tried to hide it. That night, things took a turn. Around midnight, we heard the footsteps again, but this time there was something else. A soft tapping on one of the windows. Jake reacted quickly, shutting off the lantern and signaling for me to stay low. The tapping grew louder, more insistent. Then it stopped. Moments later, there was a loud thud against the front door, as though someone had thrown their full weight against it. Jake grabbed the rifle and motioned for me to follow him into the bedroom. We barricaded the door with the bunk beds and waited. The thudding continued, punctuated by long silences. Then, just as suddenly as it began, it stopped. The next morning, we found that the front door had been dented, but it hadn't been broken down. Outside, we saw deep gouges in the wood, as if someone had tried to pry it open with a tool. Jake decided it was time to leave. We packed up quickly, loading our gear into the truck. As we were about to drive off, Jake stopped and pointed to the edge of the clearing. Standing just inside the trees was a man. He wore ragged clothes and had a long, unkempt beard. He didn't move or say anything. He just stood there, watching us. Jake didn't hesitate. He started the truck, and we drove away without a word, not daring to look back. We never reported what happened. Jake said there was no point. We didn't know enough to explain what had occurred. To this day, I don't know who that man was or what he wanted. All I know is that he wasn't just passing through. He knew we were there and he wanted something. Every time I think about that week in the cabin, a chill runs down my spine. Out there, in the middle of nowhere, we weren't alone. Whoever was out there with us wasn't just watching. They were planning something. It was a chilly evening in late September when my phone rang. My former husband, Dave, was on the line. Dave had been a detective for over a decade, and although we had been divorced for nearly 4 years, he occasionally reached out. But this call felt different. He asked me to meet him at a cabin located deep in the secluded forests of northeastern Wyoming. He assured me he'd explain everything once I arrived. I hesitated at first, but eventually agreed. Dave had always been serious and reserved. He didn't call for help unless it was urgent. We had parted ways amicably, so I figured it was worth hearing him out. Yet there was something unnerving in his tone, an edge that made my stomach churn. I packed quickly, stuffing warm clothes and a few necessities into a bag. By the time I hit the road, dusk had already settled, casting long shadows across the horizon. The drive was grueling, taking nearly 6 hours. The final stretch was a narrow dirt path weaving through towering pines, my car's headlights barely illuminating the dense darkness ahead. An uneasy feeling crept over me, as though unseen eyes were tracking my every move. When I finally arrived at the cabin, it was nearing midnight. The place looked forgotten by time. Its wooden exterior was faded, and the windows were shrouded in darkness. Dave's car was parked outside, but no lights were visible from within. I parked next to his vehicle, grabbed my flashlight, and stepped into the frigid night air. The silence was oppressive. I knocked on the door, calling his name, but no one answered. My flashlight's beam swept across the area as I cautiously pushed the door open. Inside, the cold was just as biting. The cabin was sparsely furnished. A couch, a table, and a couple of worn chairs. A faint, musty odor lingered, and everything was blanketed in dust. Near the couch, I spotted a duffel bag. It was Dave's, but he was nowhere in sight. I searched the cabin room by room. The bedroom was empty, as was the cramped bathroom. The kitchen held a few canned goods on the counter, but there were no other signs of him. It was as if he'd left in a hurry. On the table, I found a scattering of papers, some police files, and a few photographs. Holding the flashlight steady, I examined them. The reports described unsolved missing persons cases from the past 3 years. The photos were disturbing. Overgrown woods, deserted buildings, and what appeared to be a shallow grave. My pulse quickened. What had Dave gotten himself into? I stepped outside to gather my thoughts, the icy air hitting me like a slap. The forest loomed darker and more oppressive. I called out for him again, louder this time, but the only response was the rustling of leaves. As I turned back toward the cabin, something caught my eye. A boot print partially obscured by fallen leaves. It wasn't mine, and it didn't match Dave's size either. I followed the prints cautiously, my flashlight trembling in my grip. They led me into the woods, where the terrain became rough and uneven. The deeper I ventured, the quieter the forest grew, as though the world itself was holding its breath. Eventually, I came upon a small clearing. At its center was a crude campsite with a fire pit long extinguished. A tarp was strung between two trees, and beneath it lay a grim collection of items: rope, duct tape, and a hunting knife. My skin prickled with fear. Nearby, I spotted a faint trail of blood. It wasn't much, just a few drops, but they were fresh. Against my better judgment, I followed the trail. It led me to a towering tree with a shallow pit at its base, concealed by branches. Trembling, I moved the branches aside and recoiled in horror. Dave's lifeless body lay twisted in the hole, his face pale and eyes wide open, frozen in terror. A deep wound marred his neck. My breath caught, and my flashlight flickered, plunging me into darkness. When the beam steadied, I scanned the woods, expecting to see someone or something watching me. I stumbled back to the cabin, every nerve on edge. Inside, I locked the door and searched for anything I could use as a weapon. A rusty axe near the fireplace became my lifeline. Gripping it tightly, I collapsed onto the couch, trying to calm my frantic thoughts. At some point, exhaustion overtook me. I woke to the sound of deliberate footsteps crunching on the gravel outside. My heart thundered in my chest as I tightened my hold on the axe. The steps stopped just outside the door, and the doorknob began to twist. I leaped to my feet, ready to defend myself, but the door didn't budge. Instead, there was a loud thud, followed by footsteps circling the cabin. Moments later, glass shattered in the bedroom. I didn't wait to confront whoever it was. I bolted out the front door and raced to my car, fumbling with the keys. The engine roared to life, and I tore down the road, gravel spraying behind me. In the rearview mirror, I caught a glimpse of a tall figure with broad shoulders, cloaked in shadows, standing outside the cabin. They didn't pursue me, but their silhouette haunted my vision. It took nearly an hour to find a gas station with a working phone. I called the police and told them everything. The next day, they found Dave's body, but no trace of the mysterious figure. To this day, the case remains unsolved. I don't know why Dave summoned me to that cabin or what he was investigating. All I know is that someone wanted him dead, and I narrowly escaped the same fate. The memory of that shadowy figure, standing motionless in the dark, still chills me to the bone. Last winter, after my final exam, I felt like a shadow of myself. Weeks of sleepless nights, countless cups of coffee, and unrelenting stress had drained me completely. When I finally handed in my last paper, I was emotionally and physically spent. All I wanted was to vanish for a while, to find some solitude where I could recharge. I didn't have many options. Money was tight, and most of my friends had either gone home to their families or were just as broke as me. My family wasn't an option either. My parents had recently relocated overseas, leaving me to fend for myself in a modest apartment in a small Minnesota town. Desperate for a break, I remembered a cabin owned by my distant cousin, Eric. He used to let our family use it during the holidays when I was younger. It was a tiny place tucked deep in the woods near a frozen lake, about a 3-hour drive north. It wasn't fancy, but it was secluded, exactly what I needed. I reached out to Eric, and he generously said I could stay as long as I liked. He did warn me, though, the cabin was old and had very basic amenities. That didn't bother me. I packed a small bag with warm clothes, canned food, a flashlight, a few books, and my laptop. My plan was simple: sleep, read, and take a few walks in the snow. The next morning, I set off. The drive was uneventful but eerily quiet. As I left the city behind, the roads narrowed, the trees grew denser, and the radio stations faded into static. By the time I arrived, the sun was dipping below the horizon. The cabin was just as I remembered it, small with dark wooden walls, a slanted roof, and a faint trail of smoke curling from the chimney. Thanks to Eric's call to a local caretaker, the cabin was already warm. I parked my car, the snow crunching under my boots as I stepped out into the sharp, biting cold. Inside, the cabin was modest but inviting. It had a single room with a bed in one corner, a tiny kitchenette, a wood-burning stove, and a small bathroom with a composting toilet. There was no Wi-Fi, no cell signal, and only a few electrical outlets powered by a generator. The caretaker had left a neat stack of firewood by the stove, and the smell of burning pine filled the air. It was exactly the retreat I needed. That first evening was uneventful. I heated up some soup on the stove, read a few chapters of a book, and went to bed early. The silence didn't bother me. If anything, it felt soothing. For the first time in weeks, my mind was free from worries about exams and deadlines. I fell asleep quickly. The next morning, I decided to explore the area. The cabin sat near the edge of a frozen lake, surrounded by dense pines. I bundled up in warm layers, grabbed a thermos of coffee, and stepped outside. The snow was untouched, save for a few animal tracks. The lake stretched out like a mirror, reflecting the pale winter sky. As I wandered, something unusual caught my eye. Near the lake's edge, about 50 yards from the cabin, there was a small hole in the ice, surrounded by jagged edges. It didn't make sense. There hadn't been any recent signs of activity, and the ice seemed thick enough to hold a person's weight. Curious, I crouched down to take a closer look, but the water beneath was dark and uninviting. I shook off my unease and returned to the cabin. The rest of the day passed quietly. I read, napped, and tried to enjoy the solitude. But as night fell, an odd unease settled over me. The once cozy cabin now felt small and exposed. Every creak of the wooden walls and gust of wind rattling the windows set me on edge. At one point, I thought I heard footsteps crunching in the snow outside. I sat up, heart pounding, straining to listen. The sound didn't come again. Convincing myself it was just an animal, I eventually drifted off. The following morning, I discovered more tracks in the snow. These weren't animal prints. They were human footprints leading from the woods to the cabin and back toward the lake. My stomach dropped. I hadn't seen anyone since I arrived. The thought of someone outside while I slept made my skin crawl. I spent the day trying to calm my nerves. I locked the cabin door and checked the windows repeatedly. That night, I stayed awake, clutching the largest knife I could find. The footsteps came again, louder this time. They circled the cabin and stopped at the door. My heart pounded as I listened to the sound of the doorknob rattling. After what felt like an eternity, the footsteps retreated. The next morning, I noticed a second hole in the ice, closer to the cabin, only about 20 yards away. The jagged edges looked deliberate, as if someone had hacked at the ice with a sharp tool. I couldn't stay another night. I packed my things, loaded the car, and tried to leave, but the car wouldn't start. The engine was dead. Panic set in as I realized I was stranded. That night, the footsteps returned. They didn't circle the cabin this time. They stopped at the door. The knob rattled again, and I heard the faint sound of something pressing against the wood. I sat frozen, clutching the knife, until the footsteps retreated once more. By morning, a third hole had appeared in the ice, right in front of the cabin. Shortly after, I heard voices, real voices. A search party had found me. Eric had sent them when I failed to check in. I told them what happened, but they found no evidence of anyone else. No footprints, no signs of disturbance. The holes in the ice were dismissed as natural occurrences. But I know what I saw. I know what I heard, and every winter since, I can't help but remember those footsteps, circling closer and closer to the cabin. It was 2015, and I was 29 years old, working for a small lumber company deep in the mountains of Oregon. It wasn't a glamorous job, but it covered my bills, and I didn't mind the solitude. The forest stretched endlessly, with trees so dense they blocked most of the sunlight even during the day. The silence there was unusual, not peaceful but weighty, as if the forest itself were holding its breath, listening to every sound you made. Most of my shifts were long and exhausting, cutting trees, hauling logs, and repairing equipment when it broke down. I was used to it even in bad weather, but the night shifts, those were the ones I dreaded. That night, it had been pouring rain since morning. Not just a drizzle, but the kind of rain that soaked through everything, no matter how much gear you wore. My boots were full of water, and thick mud clung to my pants. The rain was relentless and cold, and the wind cut like a blade as it tore through the trees. By evening, the rest of the crew had gone home, but I had to stay behind. Night shifts were part of the job, and there was no way around them. The company's cabin was about half a mile from the logging site. It wasn't much, just a small wooden shack with a rusted tin roof, but it beat standing out in the rain all night. By the time I got there, the rain was so heavy it felt like needles against my face. I pushed open the creaky wooden door and stepped inside. The cabin was just as I remembered, cramped, damp, and barely holding together. It smelled of wet wood and mildew, but at least it was dry. I hung my drenched coat on a nail by the door and lit the kerosene lamp on the table. Its faint orange glow barely lit the small room, revealing the basics. A cot with a sagging mattress, a tiny wood stove, a wobbly table, and 2 mismatched chairs. I tried to light a fire in the stove to dry my clothes, but the wood inside was too damp, and every spark fizzled out. After a while, I gave up and wrapped myself in the scratchy blanket on the cot, listening to the storm outside. The trees groaned and creaked under the wind's force, their sounds mixing with the drumming rain. But I couldn't relax. Something about the storm felt off. Every sound seemed louder, closer, as if the forest were leaning in on the cabin. I tried to tell myself I was just imagining things, but then I heard it. At first, it blended with the storm, soft, almost imperceptible. But then it grew louder. Footsteps, heavy and deliberate, trudging slowly through the mud outside. My stomach clenched. No one should have been out there. The crew wouldn't return until morning, and there were no hikers or hunters in this area. I grabbed my flashlight from the table, my hands trembling as I flicked it on. Its beam cut through the dim cabin and landed on the rain-streaked window. I could barely see beyond the glass, just the faint silhouettes of trees swaying in the wind. Then the footsteps stopped. I froze, holding my breath. The storm raged on, but there was no other sound, just the rain hammering the tin roof and the wind whistling through the gaps in the walls. I tried to convince myself it was just an animal, a deer or maybe a bear, but something about those steps didn't feel right. Animals don't walk with that kind of deliberate rhythm. Minutes passed, though it felt like hours. Then I heard a thud. It hit the wall with a low, solid impact. Not loud, but enough to send my heart racing. I gripped the flashlight tighter and scanned the cabin walls for movement. Another thud came, this time from the opposite side. My knees wobbled as I grabbed the axe I'd left by the door earlier. The lamp flickered, casting long, dancing shadows across the room. I crept toward the window, staying low. The rain distorted everything outside, but I thought I saw something. A tall, still shape just beyond the tree line. Then came another thud, louder this time. Whatever it was circling the cabin. I couldn't stay inside. The flimsy walls wouldn't hold if something or someone tried to break in. My truck was parked about a quarter-mile away, back at the logging site. It was my only chance. I threw on my coat, gripped the axe tightly, and opened the door. Rain and wind hit me like a slap, but I forced myself outside. The mud sucked at my boots with every step as I moved quickly but cautiously, scanning the woods with my flashlight. Its beam lit only a narrow path ahead, leaving the rest of the forest shrouded in darkness. I couldn't hear the footsteps anymore, but the feeling of being watched clung to me like a weight. Finally, the truck came into view. Lightning lit up the sky, and for a brief moment, the clearing was illuminated. That's when I saw them, 3 figures standing at the edge of the clearing, just beyond the headlights. They were unnervingly still, as if waiting for something. Their faces were obscured by rain and shadow, but I could feel their eyes on me. I didn't think, I just ran. Fumbling with the keys, I unlocked the truck, jumped in, and locked the doors. The engine roared to life, and I floored it, mud spraying behind me. The figures didn't move as I sped away, but I glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting them to follow. They didn't. They just stood there, watching. I didn't stop until I reached the main road, miles away. Even then, I couldn't shake the feeling of their eyes on me. To this day, I don't know who or what they were, but on stormy nights, I think of that cabin. I think about how they didn't try to stop me. It wasn't fear, it was a warning, and that thought still keeps me awake.